Okay, this is the first time ever that we started exactly on time. My name's Pat Ruzz. I work part-time for an outfit called the Michigan Wildlife Conservancy. I don't work for the DNR or any other government agency, although I work kind of with them on wild hog control in the state. I'm here in part because I would really like to see hogs brought under control in Michigan, and also because I am paid to be here. There's a grant from the NRCS of the U.S. Department of Agriculture that I think the grant title is called Early Detection and Control of Invasive Exotic Species, and that's what we're talking about here. Probably the biggest and baddest exotic invasive species that Michigan has ever seen. There's a lot of people, scientists and others that freak out when we get little bitty snails and water fleas and things show up in the Great Lakes, and they are sometimes extremely harmful, and certainly we need to take those serious. But this is kind of like off the board, as they say. We're talking about an animal that can be 300 pounds easily and causes a variety of damage that is just unmatched by anything Michigan's had before. I think a second thing, or real important fact you should know at the start of this, is that this is one problem that when it shows up in your neighborhood and on your property, the government is not going to say that. Okay, I'm not going to say it. Nobody is. I mean, it's really something, because the hogs are spread out already over such a very large area. Pretty much it's something that landowners you're in the front, you're in the battle lines. The job, I think, and role that government and private sector groups like the one I work for, Michigan Wildlife Conservancy, it's going to be to try to give you as much help as we possibly can. But there's no bunch of people jumping out of black helicopters that are going to come in and wipe out the hogs for us. I mean, it's done at a grassroots level pretty much all around the world, or it isn't done at all. And frankly, the track record of the hogs is real good, and of the hog controllers is real bad. There's only been a few spots where hogs have actually been eradicated. There's some areas where they've been brought under control pretty well. And then everything in between, in a few places, Texas, what comes to mind is one where it's absolutely out of control. Well, the first thing I want to do is give you a little history. I'm from a little town called St. Charles, first of all, and I just found out a few minutes ago, really, that you have been invaded by another invasive exotic species. That's people from St. Charles. There's some around here that have slipped undetected and undocumented into your area. So isn't that Tom Krozek back there? He's a longtime resident of St. Charles, and I just found out that one of the guys I coached at St. Charles in football, Scott Wicke, lives close by here. So you've been invaded by St. Charles people, and here's another one tonight. We're in western, actually central, right smack in the middle of Saginaw County, and we have some of the highest wild hog densities in the state, just 10 or 15 miles from us. The Marion Springs area. Marion Springs is a tiny little town about the size of Dale, and it's a kind of, there's wild hogs in a strip about 5 by 6 miles, so about 30 square miles there, probably with a density about as high as you're going to find any place else in the state. With the possible exception of Mecosta and Midland County have some spots with real high hog density. How high is it? Well, yesterday I walked just on state land over there in the Gratiot County, Gratiot-Saginaw State Game Area, and in an hour and a half I found a sounder, which is the basic social group of wild hogs that had at least 2 sows in it and a bunch of little ones. They left tracks about this big, so they were probably only 40, 50 pounds in an hour and a half with no trouble. Just walking. So they've had some fields there with 100% crop damage. It's Texas-style problems brought to Michigan. How did it all get started? It is a long story. We don't have a long time tonight, so to give you the briefest bit of it, back many years ago, we started to have an increase in the number of game ranches that offered hunts for mostly deer and elk and a variety of other sorts of things. And they were getting some pressure or impetus to bring in something cheaper. And this was a problem for a while because they could not bring in wild boars from Tennessee or some of the other states because of disease concerns, unless they had papers, etc. So they wanted to get wild hogs in and really couldn't do it for a long time. A few of them did, but they couldn't then offer the hunts cheaply. Well, then Canadian government got involved. For once, it was not our own government, but it was the Canadian government that kind of should shoulder a little bit of the blame. They got the idea that they needed to diversify Canadian livestock industry, and they decided to go get some wild boars from Europe, bring them over, and sell them to Canadian game ranches and also to their good friends to the south, us, and provide disease-free status papers with them. So that opened up a real big market for the game ranches. They started to import them from Canada with disease-free papers. Once they got into Michigan, those disease-free animals then could be used as breeding stock, more could be produced. Pretty soon Michigan people wanted in on the action because it was quite lucrative. They told me that back in the early 2000s, they could raise a domestic pig and hope to get about 26 cents an acre, a pound, 26 cents a pound live weight. You can correct me if any of you are pig farmers and that's off, but that's what I was told, is that that was a reasonable price. And then the wild boars that you could raise with about the same amount of effort netted about $1.15 a pound. So there was a huge financial impetus or incentive to get into that. So pretty soon, everybody was doing it. They were being raised in, one basement that I know of, several dog kennels, an old garage. Any place where you could shove feed in, wild boars were getting ready. Some of those escaped, and there also were a number of escapes from game ranches. The game ranch industry will bitterly contest how many came from the game ranches versus other sources, and they still are today, and are actually in court against the DNR on that. But some of them certainly came from game ranches because people saw the holes in the fences and they saw the hogs coming out. And in the area near St. Charles, that was certainly the case. Up here in Gladwin, I don't really know for sure. Over in Gladwin County, there was a pretty well-known release there. Of between 3 dozen to 100 hogs got loose about 2004 or so, someplace in there, depending on who you want to talk to. But there certainly were those releases, and today, generally, the hog numbers are highest pretty darn close to those facilities still. Deer seasons rousted them, they moved out, and again, those social groups, the Sounders, sometimes got ran off 20, 30 miles, sometimes only 2 miles, and they went in all directions. I think Gladwin County probably didn't, you were not in the major path of some of the big releases, which tended to go more towards the east, up to Rifle River Rec area, for example, got a bunch of hogs shortly after the release in Midland. So, you can put these things together and you can kind of come up with a picture. Whether it's exactly right or not, we don't know. So we don't know exactly where a particular group of hogs. Some of them had ear tags on the game ranches. Those we know exactly where they came from. And we could trace those all the way back to Canada. But the rest of them, they're just kind of finding, various pockets across the state. Right now, the highest densities are in Costa County, western Saginaw, Midland, Bay, Aranac, and we're not really sure about Hogan. There are populations in 72 out of the 83 counties, but in some of those we're only talking about a few pigs. So it's not a problem where they're all over the place. They're in certain pockets right now, but they have a tendency, to build up over time, and eventually states that have pigs get started, end up down the road all of a sudden waking up in a pig mound going, and there's pigs everywhere. So the biologists say this, all of them, and I've worked with this species. They say the best time to start your landowner workshop sessions like we're having here is 10 years before the first hog shows up. Okay. We're about 10 years after the first one showed up, so we're about 20 years late. But they say that, and it's a joke, but it's not a joke. You really got to, if you're serious about early detection and then control and jumping on these things when they first show up, we're behind the 8 ball right now and playing catch up. That's, I guess, a lot of bad news to hit you with right off to the start. But I think the one good thing we got going for us now in Michigan is that they have not spread as fast to various areas as we thought they might. At first we kind of pictured a steady movement out from these population centers, and they haven't done that as fast as we thought. They're moving just a mile or two, it seems like a year, but the numbers that we're getting in some of the areas are quite high, a little bit surprisingly high in some places. So people from out of state say, well, what you're seeing is the fact that Michigan habitat can support a lot of hogs. And so they're building up, still building up in those areas, and then eventually population pressure is going to shove them out. So that's kind of what the history and status we're at right now. Your area was picked not because you are a hog hotspot right now, but because you're kind of on the edge of one, actually the edge of a couple pretty good populations. So it'll help me and the program a lot if you fill out those survey forms, regardless, again, whether you've seen any. Who's doing what? Let me cover that real quick, just so there's no confusion. A number of people, ask me, am I from the DNR? The answer is no. But the DNR is playing a key role in hog control by trying to enforce a ban that was put into effect a year ago that simply stopped the importation of hogs and the possession of live hogs. Both things are really important. They're saying that we can't bring any more legally into the state, which is kind of the first step in hog control. And then the second is that you can't possess live ones, which means that you can't move around hogs. That's being contested in court right now, and so the DNR is a little bit tied up with those kind of court actions. The control programs, such as they are, is basically spearheaded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Wildlife Services branch. They're the people that try to get rid of birds at airports if they're a nuisance, or cormorants in the Great Lakes, things, fishing birds, keep them under control. That's the kind of thing they've done historically for a long, long time. And the conservancy that I work for has a partnership with them in that we support them by getting money for hog traps, helping in other ways, and doing education and workshop programs like this. I've got a PhD in wildlife. That's kind of what I've done all my career for almost 40 years now. Although I look like I'm in my 20s, I've actually been around for a while, and got to the opportunity to work with people that do hog control in Hawaii and in Florida in particular, and learn some things down there that do apply up here. They don't have the same kind of wild hog exactly, but they've got something that's pretty nasty, and they've got decades and decades, and in Hawaii even centuries of experience dealing with the animals. So we lean on those people, quite heavily. So there are some people in Michigan that are real good at hog traffic control. A lot of them have lived down south with them. Believe it or not, people do move up here from Florida and places like that, Alabama. We've got several people that worked on the Fort Benning, Georgia hog depopulation project that was probably one of the biggest ones in the country, where they're trying to get them off the military base. And they live like right around here. One of the fellows lives in Mount Pleasant, and they'll go anywhere to help anybody trap that wants to get rid of wild hogs and give them any other kind of assistance. So there's a network of people. We have about 160 volunteers in the state that kind of know what they're doing and are available for help. So we kind of got a war chest available, but the key, again, the front lines people are the landowners. When you see hogs, when you see their sign, you need to let somebody know about it. It doesn't mean you're going to sell your soul to the government or anything like that, but find out what kinds of help's available. You'll be amazed. It's the only program maybe in the world that you can enter into and get some government help with no red tape. You don't do anything except sign your name and say, yes, I got a trap from you and eventually I'll give it back. That's it. And we'll talk again more on that, and I'll tell you, there isn't any other government program like that. Okay? But there is some really good help available, and there's some volunteers that'll help you. Chances are you're going to probably forget most of what I tell you tonight. If you do, there's a website that you can go to. It's on my business card there. It's miwildlife.org. And if you wade through the different clicks there, eventually you'll find something that says about hog trapper training. And there'll be a different version, a long video, that has 5 segments, and it walks you through a lot of the same information that's covered tonight, just in a different way. So there's ample opportunity to get educated about this whole thing, so you're better prepared to defend your property when the hogs show up. First thing I want to do as far as showing things, I want to give you an idea of what happens when hogs come to your neighborhood. And again, this is not Texas or Louisiana. This is down in Saginaw County, about 12 miles from my house. So I got a call one day from one of our volunteer hog trappers. He says, you got enough pictures of hog sign? And I says, kinda. He goes, yeah, well, you might want to see this. And so this was fall before last, so this was like fall of 2011. And this is not a plowed field. That's hogs did that. That was a winter wheat field that had been seeded about 2 weeks before, and the hogs came through there. Could you flip those lights down up? Might make it show up a little bit better. But the hogs showed up and started sifting through the field, and that's what they did to it. Way back, that tree line way in the back is like at least half to 3/4 of a mile away. And the fella in the photos, that's the school superintendent, former school superintendent, Jim Slick. He's about 6'4", so you get an idea of the scale in there. But he's not kneeling there at the edge of it, showing the rooting in a hayfield and how deep it can get. I've seen hog rooting myself 2.5 feet deep in Florida in the sand. This was about a foot and a half deep in spots, but you see they really tore it up. I put Jim Slick in there just so there'd be somebody you could trust. You can't trust a school superintendent. Jim's one of our volunteers. But what's shown here is what I call exploratory rooting or exploratory trenches. They come into a field and they'll put their nose down and they just start to go. And their nose and tongue is working. They're sifting through and see if there's any grubs, any worms, anything that they can eat. If there's a calorie in it, they're going to take it. So if they sift through there and they're not really excited about what they're getting, they'll just leave this much and go on. But if they like the density of wheat seed in there, they finally, the light bulb goes off, that there's these little bitty seeds that I can vacuum up, you know, and take with my tongue like an anteater. That's when they go to town and they do the damage you're talking about. Corn's a little bit different. There's not a whole lot of sampling there. They just walk in and start eating. And they'll chew the stalks right down to close to the base. I don't know if they so much like to eat corn stalks, but I don't know, they just chew it down real close. And that's something that looks a lot different than when deer or raccoons or even bear get into a cornfield. And eventually the patches that they work over good will look like the one on the right, and they're just down to nothing. What they can't eat, tear up with their mouths, then they kind of just stomp on for spite. And usually when you get into these kind of crop damage situations, and two types of the year when they're hit. The wheat they always get right after it's planted. They get the seed before it even comes up. Corn and beans, they'll hit it in spring when it's about up to 3 inches high. They'll go right down the rows, and then they will hit, well, they'll hit most any kind of crops at one time or another, but like with corn, they'll leave it alone then until just starts to ripen. So late August and September is when they hit it the hardest. And then of course if they're chased into it, say deer season, they'll just stay right in the cornfield. If you have some question as to whether you have crop damage that's caused by hogs, almost in every case, if you look around and go over to the woods areas or where there's any water, you'll see other signs that'll tip you off that it's hogs and nothing else. And a wallow is a real good tip. Here's one right across. This was right across the road from the winter wheat field, and then my car keys are laying in part of this wallow, and you can see the individual lines with the hog's hair. You know where he laid in there. That's what those straight, streaks are. That's the individual hog hair. Tracks, they do leave tracks. A lot of people mistake those. What did I do? I leaned on it. Left arrow. Okay. I have to. Okay, hang on a second. Okay. Let's back up again. They look a lot like deer tracks to the average person. There's a couple of things that you can tell. They're in soft ground, and you can see the dew claw prints. These are called dew claws, just like on a deer. They don't line up behind the individual hoofs like they do with a deer. With a deer, these dew claws would be right directly behind each of the corresponding hoofs. They're quite a bit outside it, as you can see there. And that's a pretty good depth giveaway that you're dealing with a wild hog instead of a deer. Otherwise, they're supposed to be rounder. All the books tell you that. I see an awful lot of them that look square in the kind of ground we have here in mid-Michigan. Some of them will look a little longer than they are wide, which they're not supposed to, but again, they get in soft ground and their weight pushes forward, they'll slightly elongate the track. But yesterday when I was out looking for sign, one of the things that tipped me off is that I saw either a hog track or a doe with 7 fawns behind her, all this big around big tracks. And so sometimes it's pretty obvious what you're looking at, and that was the case in that one. So dew claws are really good. They do have a roundish aspect. This one has a round aspect to that. But I've shown hog tracks to many people, including very experienced deer hunters, and they've said deer instantly. I knew they were hogs because the hog was standing in them when I took the picture. We were at game ranches, and we shooed the hog off and took the picture, and they looked just like deer. But if you look at enough of them, you'll get some of them that'll have that dew claw giveaway or some of these other things. That's why we tell even our experienced volunteers that mostly use tracks to get your suspicions up. and then you look for rooting, you look for wallows, and other sorts of things to kind of make up your mind. This here's a real good sign. This is mud that they picked up in the wallow being smeared on a tree. They rub up against it to push that mud farther in and get the excess mud off, and a variety of other reasons. But they love to rub, and when you get in some of the creeks around here that'll dry up in July, especially in August and September, and they like to rub on trees, of course, real close to the wallow. They don't go off a mile and then start rubbing. So they go, you know, just to the nearest trees or so. A lot of times those are cottonwoods or poplar, and they're light colored. So the mud shows up like a sore thumb. You can be walking through the woods and see this from 50 yards away, you know, sometimes with relative ease. And when hogs first started coming into some of the areas of Michigan, I was out with people, and we saw this sort of thing, and almost everybody I was with would say beaver right away when they'd see this mud on there, because that's the only animal they could think of that smears mud on anything. So they'd walk right past hog sign and be putting it, you know, on beaver. This is a kind of a lousy photograph of a hog bed. These are really important, especially to get hog piglets through the winters. The piglets are born without much hair, and they really don't do well in weather 20 degrees or less, which we've had up to about 3 days ago. And so when they're first born, until they put on a little size, weight, and get a little more hair, they pretty much got to have some kind of a bed that they're in. And domestic pigs do that too. If you give them a chance, they'll take anything that they can get, and they'll kind of make themselves a bed to drop the piglets in. Well, they do that as well. Good spots to find them are like the tall, warm season grass, if anybody plants that as part of a CRP program. Farmers will switchgrass, big blue stem. They'll go in those and make beds. They'll also sometimes do it in cornfields. And when they do that in a pit cornfield, you'll come along and hear this big mound of corn, leaves and stalks and everything made into a giant nest. And that really sticks out, especially in winter. When you go to a pit cornfield, you'll see what looks like a big muskrat lodge. It's not as high, but you'll see that right in the middle of a dry field. You know, and I don't want you all in here then to see that and say, what's that muskrat doing out in the middle of a dry cornfield? That's what the hog's doing. And I've got some photos, I just haven't put them in the PowerPoint yet, that show them, and I mean, they stick out like crazy. You could see those from a car going past the with binoculars with these. And some people have done that. Okay. I'll go right to the next slideshow here. Hopefully. This thing fights me every once in a while, but
Let's see what those data first.
okay. I'm not Jack Mayer. I wish I had his money. He'd laugh at me at that. But Jack Mayer is probably the foremost pig expert, certainly in the United States, maybe one of the best in the world. How many of you have seen those shows like American Hogger and the Hog Buster, any kind of those reality shows? And, you know, they have Monster Quest, one where they were looking for the world's largest wild hog. There's about like 15 reality shows. Well, he ends up at some point on those because they go to the conservative expert, you know, as the counterpoint to all the wild claims of whatever character they're featuring. So he's usually the guy that ends up on TV. But he directs the longest running, or one of the longest running hog research programs down at the Savannah River National Laboratory. And he's come up free of charge to Michigan 3 times we first brought him up about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. He stayed at my house, and we went around and drove him to where the hogs were showing up, and he just looked and shook his head, and he said, hogs are going to love Michigan. And, you know, he's tried to do everything he can to help us since. Again, he hasn't charged us a nickel for it. DNR brought him up a year ago. Previous to that, he was brought up by the Michigan Wildlife Conservancy and also by Michigan pork producers, which is very concerned about the problem. So he provided this little slideshow that's going to follow. And what you'll see from time to time through it is this little icon, and that's Jack's way of reminding us that the pig bomb will go off eventually. And it may not be quite that dramatic. You might not hear the explosion one day and look up. But all of a sudden, you look out the door, and so do your neighbors, and you start seeing things you haven't seen before. Like hay fields tore up, like your lawn tore up, like back at the table back there. There's a photo there of Tom Roche over in Dade County. He's a potato farmer, and they went to the mall there in Midland. Were gone about 3 hours, and when they came back, that's what their yard looked like. And they know it was hogs because they saw them standing under the mercury light, and they were able to shoot two before they totally got out of the area. But you will see, you know, that what can be a small, amusing problem or curiosity for a while can turn into a nightmare because eventually the bomb, she goes off. The other little icon he uses will come up later, but keep that in mind when you see that bomb, that Jack assures you that you know, having hogs in the area is they always say being like being a little bit pregnant. It's, you know, going to happen. So this slide, you know, don't be confused by all those arrows and X's. What it's telling you is that all of the wild hogs, the ones you see on these reality shows, the spotted ones, the two-toned ones, the ones that got big tusks, ones that got no tusk at all, they're all members of the same genus and species. The Russian wild boar there is shown off to the upper right, and they will crossbreed readily, no problem. So a Russian wild boar will eagerly mate with a domestic pig. And that just, they're all suscrofa. And so what we have around the world is we've got every manner of pig you can possibly imagine that are all called feral wild hogs, wild boars, wild hogs, whatever. They're all of the same genus and species. So what has happened in America is that if people didn't like the hog that they were hunting particularly and they wanted to juice it up a little bit, they would just get some of the Russian wild boars from somewhere, bring them in, and as they said, improve the genetics, or, you know, make the vampire even bigger. So that's kind of what people can and have done. Because hogs can be moved around, you know, easily, they have not only influenced hog numbers, people, but also influenced the actual genetics and the physical characteristics of the hogs. And I'll be talking more about that too. If you remember nothing else from my babbling tonight, remember these two slides right here, because I think they say a lot of it. Here's the distribution of hogs in 1990. Pretty much a southern population, except for up in New England. There was some escapees from a game ranch, and when the map was put together, they showed that as a pig state. But here it is in 2008, 18 years later. And this did not occur because of the march north, natural migration north of the pigs, but because people could and did move them around. The pig is, the wild hogs are really hardy as far as being able to be moved. You don't need an air-conditioned limo in order to transport them. They're kind of like a snapping turtle. You put it in a car trunk, and then you take off. You drive all through Nevada, and it's still alive. That's kind of like how a hog is. And you know, I got tipped off of some hog movements one time from a guy who had a call from a manager at a U-Haul station in Tennessee. And his U-Haul trailers were all coming back full of wild hog hair and the droppings and everything else. And he says, they are renting the U-Hauls for just about 4 days, which is about the time, you know, that they can go up, get paid, you know, hit a bar for a night, and then make it back. And he says, and then they start all over. And you know, this has been going on for quite a few years. It's not a major problem that we had in Michigan, but apparently it is in other states. And you know, recently a problem developed in Ohio, and that was probably again people moving these things around. They can be trapped alive or captured alive with dogs. They are easy to hold, at least temporarily, and extremely easy to transport. And you know, they can, you know, basically be brought to almost any place. There aren't too many habitats that they aren't adapted to. The problem is there's survivors that can live just about anywhere, hot areas, cold areas. It was kind of ironic that when the pigs first escaped in Michigan, one of the big releases was in the Abbey Peninsula, which juts out into Lake Superior, way up in Barraga County. And the Huron Lodge Hunting Club or whatever had some up there. They got loose and they immediately started terrorizing the countryside, more or less, tearing up gardens. And a few people supposedly got chased by them. And a county prosecutor, is that the right word? Yeah, well, he worked for the county. He was their lead attorney. So I don't know if anyhow, he went and wrote the letters to then Governor Engler, you know, asking for help and clarification. This was nuts. And then a representative named Brown jumped in and tried to pass legislation that made it legal for anybody to shoot the hogs. And you say, well, of course it's legal. Well, no, it wasn't. Back then, the rule was that they were protected if they came out of a game ranch under Michigan's 1888 or something, livestock at large law. That was the law that protected somebody's cow. If it wandered over to the neighbors, they couldn't pot it and put it in their refrigerator. So they were told they couldn't do it. And so, and that, you know, the DNR was ready to write tickets if they did. So the legislator put forth a bill and it died, didn't get out of committee. And the reason was it was opposed not only by the DNR, but it was opposed by a number of groups that said, this is overreaction, nothing to worry about because they won't survive in Michigan. It's a southern species. Remember the map I showed you? And that's, you know, they're a down south species. They wouldn't survive our winters, but, you know, they were Russian wild boars. And it gets pretty cold in Russia, I'm told, and almost as cold as Gladwin County. So, anyhow, I don't know, I got off on a tangent there, but the point is that they can live in any kind of climate, snow or not snow, because they use those beds, and that helps them get the piglets safe. And once the piglets get any size at all, there's really few natural predators that they're vulnerable to. The sow is a pretty good protector. They have a really high reproductive potential. Without getting into the gory details, there have been some sows killed just a county or 20 miles or so from you that when they opened them up, they had as many as 9 fetuses in them. So that's kind of reproduction rate for an animal that size is off the board. You're talking about a doe that's quite fertile in their prime will maybe produce 3 fawns. 2 is kind of the norm. You're talking about an animal that is even heavier, producing 9, 8, 9, 5 litters of 5 running around with a sow are not uncommon. And that kind of reproduction is just scary huge. The average number of litters per year works out to about 1.2 per year when you crunch the numbers and average it all. So that's about as fast a reproductive rate is seen anywhere for an animal that size. By the way, that one photo up there where it's gnawing on something that's gnawing on a calf. A lot of people think that that's his other little icon to remind you how fast these things reproduce. You'll see that again. But a lot of people are shocked to find out that wild boars, and domestic pigs for that matter, they're not vegetarians. They will eat anything with a calorie in it, as biologists like to say, and they'll eat meat real readily. They find dead deer carcasses in the woods. They'll eat them. In fact, that's a real good bait to use up north. We'll talk more about baiting later. They really raise a whole heck of a lot of ruckus with fawns too, and they're very good fawners. They'll go right through the ferns, kind of like a bear, and pick them off. There's no other animal that does the variety of damage that wild hogs do, and that's what a lot of the rest of this slideshow is about. Some of it I'll go through kind of fast. They root, as you already saw in the winter wheat field photos here in Michigan. They root really deep, and in some places they root to such an extent that it alters the soil chemistry, such that the fields never reproduce like they once did, ever. I mean, they'll permanently destroy fields and reduce their crop yields for years to come. They actually have to be kind of rehabilitated. Their wallowing in some places in the country is so severe it actually impacts water quality. In Hawaii, they oftentimes will have their fecal coliform levels affected in streams that provide drinking water for periods when the hogs and wild goats are in, so that they can't use the water. There's been some studies in Louisiana that shows really big impact. We don't have anything like that quite going on here in Michigan yet, but and just these slides show you the range and kinds of impacts that these things have. They are constantly eating roots of trees, which cause them to die or to root sucker, give up a bunch of shoots. They just move and it seems to affect everything. Lately, there's been a huge increase in hogs in urban areas, and we're going to see some slides later on about that. Forest and timber damage, mostly down south is where they really get whacked. And they'll seed loblolly pine or something after a timber harvest, and the hogs will go right along and just pull up the trees left and right. So there aren't too many kinds of animals that will actually eat trees, but they do it. They'll sometimes chew the lateral roots on mature pines and kill them. If they get into an orchard, they can not only girdle trees, but they'll also tusk them up really bad. You know, we've got one in Michigan. We've got one orchard owner right now that's getting a little bit of damage and is starting to get real concerned about it. The agriculture damage, when I think this takes it back. No. When the
the second one.
Okay. When I first started giving this presentation back a few years ago, the figure everybody agreed to was $800 million of damage that they do annually. Now it's $1.5 billion in just 2 or 3 years. It's changed that much. And again, you've seen some examples of that. They hit just about everything. In Florida, they really like to hit the lychee nut growers down there. It's a new kind of nut that I guess originated in Vietnam, and I don't know what all they use it for. Oil or whatever, but they really raise heck with that. They hit peanuts real hard down south. There's just about no crop that they won't eat. They pretty much get it all. So again, if they don't seem to be connoisseurs of food. They just, again, if it's got a calorie, go after it. As far as competition with other wildlife, the most serious documented impacts are on deer, bear, and turkeys. They really compete with them for acorns and a lot of other important foods. And they really have quite an effect on rare, threatened, and endangered species. I saw some of this Hawaii firsthand. I forget how many thousands of plants they have that are grown no place else but in Hawaii. And Nature Conservancy spends millions of dollars trying to protect some of these things. And when the hogs get in there, it seems like that's the first thing that goes. So they eat endangered plants way up on the top of mountains and then way down in the lowest levels down by sea level. So that's a really big problem. The Nature Conservancy actually has spent a lot of money fencing off those areas because they just can't keep the hogs out. Same thing's true for animals like sea turtles even, especially down south in South Carolina, Florida, parts of Georgia. They get endangered animals too. They will prey on eggs of ground nesting game birds. You know, how much it affects them, I'm not really sure, but there's quite a few hogs in a few spots of the Kirtland's warbler range up by Grayling, and you know, those little warblers, gazillions of dollars has been spent on trying to, you know, they provide tasty snack for hogs going through. How much, again, damage they're doing there, I don't know, but they're in the same areas and it's got people real concerned. Disease transmission is really important. I'm not going to talk too much about that tonight in the interest of time, but if you want to read some scary stuff, just go to your computer when we're done tonight, type in wild hogs and diseases, and it's a real eye-opener. The one we're worried about in Michigan in particular is pseudorabies, and the pseudorabies virus is not a threat to humans, it's a threat to domestic pigs. Michigan got, in the year 2000, got pseudorabies status for its herd, and that was very important to be able to ship hogs out of state. And that's in jeopardy if the pseudorabies gets transferred into the domestic herd by any kind of contact. Would you ever have to worry about that up here? Oh, heck yes. Because there were 4 game ranches that had to be depopulated because of the threat of pseudorabies, animals from the same herd that was transferred to different game ranches had to be wiped out by USDA, and one of them was in Gladwin County. So far as free roaming wild hogs, 10 have been positive. 9 of them came from Saginaw County, close to where I live, and 1 positive came from Redmond. And this has really got the attention of the Michigan pork producers. That's why they are active in both trying to support the ban and also in landowner education and things like that, because I mean they're scared to death of it getting into the domestic herd where it kills the young piglets and would get rid of that pseudorabies-free status. Brucellosis is a problem too, and recently kind of the ante has gone up because they found out that the tuberculosis, the bovine tuberculosis that is a threat to the cattle in Michigan. It's the same kind of tuberculosis that hogs carry. It's mutated over the years, isn't that nice? They're pretty much identical. So hogs and livestock can potentially transfer it back and forth. Property damage, lawns, sprinkling systems. When I was out in Hawaii, they were telling me that at some of the golf courses, the hogs will root down on the greens to the PVC pipes that they use for plastic pipes for irrigation. And then they bite them in half and then get a drink. So they learn to do that. They have quite a trapping program there where the Hawaiian DNR flies in with helicopters, box traps that they drop on the green. Somebody hooks it off a cable and then waves to the pilot. That's instant trapping out for the high-priced golf courses. Wild pig vehicle collisions. that to me is kind of amazing. We haven't had a lot of it in Michigan. There was a pretty spectacular crash on US 10, I was told. When you hit one of these things, it can be really bad news. Jack Mayer describes it as hitting a 5-drawer file cabinet full of concrete. And when you hit it, unlike a deer, which tends to bounce and get higher or at the same level as a car, you tend to roll over it like a speed bump, and the car often gets airborne, hits the opposite side ditch or a tree, and that's why the damage is so high. They did an extensive study in Sweden where they compared the injuries to people and the amount of auto damage per accident, and they found that it was 2.5 times higher for wild hog collisions than it was for collisions with moose. And I mean, they're legendary. You don't want to hit these with a car. So if they ever walk out in front of you and at night and you catch them in the headlights and you say, boy, pork chops, here I come. Now you don't want to do that. You know, it's really bad. I saw, the only accident I actually witnessed was in Florida last year. And I saw a guy hit a really big, small pig. I mean, it was only like about big. But he was stopped there, and there was, you know, parts of his grill laying here, and parts of the headlight here. He was scratching his head, knowing what to do. He just lucky it wasn't a big one. Attacks on humans. I get asked about this all the time, and I don't know what to tell you. It happens. Is it likely? No. Do you have to be worried walking around your woods? No. You know, yesterday I walked right around and walked out at night. They aren't going to get you, as a rule. Have anybody in Michigan ever been chased? Yeah, many times. This was especially if they happened to be around a game ranch and the hogs had just escaped. There were some spectacular chases. Now, whether those hogs were just in a foul mood, whether they were going to the person to get fed, because they spent, you know, weeks in captivity up till then. They've been raised, you know, under wire, or whether they were actually at the people, no one really knows, and especially the people who were chased, no, they don't care. They just know that it was not a good experience. The thing, I don't worry myself about ever being attacked, walking around the woods, or having any of you ever get attacked wandering in the woods, mushroom picking. Don't gotta worry. But if you're a hunter and you shoot one, it isn't like following the blood trail of a deer. And bow hunters worry me more than anything else, because a lot of bow hunters aren't going to resist sticking an arrow in one. And the classic heart-lung shot area behind the shoulder, a hog can go an awful lot of ways with that kind of hit. They have some cartilage and bone structure behind there that kind of protects them, so they don't kill each other readily when they fight from the tusk. And that can, you don't get quite the penetration you do on a deer, and so there is a potential for hunters to be attacked as they follow the blood trail. That, you know, every once in a while somebody will get maimed or killed that way. So there is some danger, and you've got to really be on your toes if you hit them. Would I shoot at one with a bow? Yeah. Would I be ultra careful after it? Yes. And I probably wouldn't just grab the bow and trot after it in the cornfield with a flashlight. Ain't gonna happen. So that's kind of what you got to worry about. There's an increasing number in urban areas. Berlin has thousands of them now, because they don't hunt them anymore in that city park, and they've got hogs all over the place, and occasionally somebody gets in trouble there. We've had people chased on jogging trails, and I like to tell this story, so please put up with me for a second. When I first started to try to alert people and talk to legislators about the wild hog problem that was coming down the pipe here in Michigan, you know, I might have been talking about seeing Elvis or aliens or whatever. You know, they'd say, "Thank you, Dr. Ruz, for enlightening me, and if you excuse me, I gotta go, pass legislation about, the length of forks in restaurants or something else. And then this little girl got chased. See, the problem is, I talk about this horrendous problem in Deckerville, or Marion Springs, or Crump, Michigan, and the legislators didn't have the time to be concerned about that. But this little girl got chased down in Ann Arbor, where there's a lot of registered voters and a lot of campaign contributors. She got chased, a person helped her, he got chased too, and then the state trooper ended up shooting 2 wild hogs. Then all of a sudden, the legislators' aides were calling up saying, how could this grievous problem have ever started, in Michigan? And they were just all up in arms about it. And then they started to listen. And of course, you're never going to get any of them to admit it, but between all of us and that camera back there and the video going, that's exactly what happened. Okay, and then all of a sudden they started paying a whole lot more attention when it started to become not a problem out in the boondocks, but a problem that could, potentially have people killed or maimed. Was she in any trouble? I don't know. I wasn't there, but it was a scary thing. And whether, again, these hogs had just been escaped from a game ranch, so they might have just been running to people. I mean, who knew? But, the fact is, when something like that happens and it makes the papers, then all of a sudden everybody's attitude started to change, and they at least started to listen. Okay, control techniques. I'm not going to go through all of these fast, but I can just tell you this, that whatever you count on to get rid of hogs, it has to be able to take 50 to 75% of the population every year to just stabilize or begin to reduce hog numbers. So what do we have available that could possibly do this? In the beginning, when people first heard about this, we had legislators saying, okay, it's done. And I would say, what's done? We took care of the hog problem. I said, you did? Where was I? I must have been watching the Tigers on TV or something when they did this. And, I had one legislator say this many, many times at different hearings and things. We took care of the hog problem 2 years ago when we passed the legislation that said anybody could shoot one whenever they show up. So the people will take care of them. And the deer hunters, we have 750,000 deer hunters. They'll take care of the hogs. And that was it. The problem was solved in her mind and in most of the legislators because you just shoot them. Okay? Our trail cameras consistently show all of our hogs between 11 at night and 4 in the morning. And I don't know how many of you hunt that during that time period, but these are an animal that becomes very, very nocturnal, and in the best spots where they traditionally have hunted hogs all year round, like in Georgia, none of them ever get more than 30% of the population by shooting. By sitting in the woods and trying to hunt them. Now, then you kick in with dogs, and then you have traps and everything else, and they still don't keep up with the hogs. And so we're talking about something where it's been proven in other states and other parts of the world that you don't just pass a law that says you can shoot. It does not begin to solve your problem because you can't hit that 50 to 75% population. Maybe you could pull that off with deer some places, but you aren't ever going to pull that off with hogs. Because what they do is they reproduce like hotcakes. Now, is there some other things you can do? Texas now has a aircraft shooting program that's getting them a lot of money. There's some people making a lot of money putting people up in helicopters and letting them shoot pigs. But last time I heard, Texas's population is still continuing to go up, and they believe now they may have 5 million hogs in Texas. You can trap them, and that's what we are emphasizing right now because it's safe and it's pretty inexpensive, and it's a good way for us to get pseudo-rabies samples, frankly. Effective it is as population control depends on the intensity that people do it. And, so that's what the rest of this talk tonight is going to be about. But there's all kinds of limitations to it. It's not practical for large-scale use by agencies. That means basically that if the landowners don't do it themselves, it ain't going to get done. So that's kind of where we're at. Use of dogs, that works real well. I aged about 15 years in about 3 hours down in Florida a couple of years ago, working with the animal control people down there. We got 3 hogs in 45 minutes in pitch darkness. The only weapon we had was a 3-inch jackknife. We had one between 4 guys. And it was interesting to say the least. But they hunt throughout the South and other places in the world with dogs. We have some dog hunters here in Michigan that do okay. But yet there's some problems associated with that too. One is that until the hog population gets real high, very few people will put the time, money, and effort it takes to get a real good hog dog pack. And by that time, it's probably too late to actually control. They've got people that I went with down in Florida, they got $20 per hog plus a harassment fee from the cattle ranchers so that they could get through the calving season. Because the cattle, as soon as they would drop the calves, the hogs would get them. And I must have skipped, with my heavy fingers here, I must have skipped one slide because I had a slide about livestock damage in here. And they've shut down the Angola sheep industry in one area of Texas. And in Australia, they'll take 40% of the newborn lambs in quite a few of the key sheep here areas. So they're really definitely on livestock. And that's occurs down in cattle country down in Florida. That's a big concern they have with wild hogs. How do they get through calving season? So they'll have people come in with dogs, get as many as they can, and then generally stir them up so they go on the other rancher's property. So that's kind of what occurs down there. I think I'm going to stop there and just tell you a little bit. Yeah. There's some more stuff on that we're going to cover elsewhere, but this is how Jack ends his slideshow. You know, there's a lot of different techniques that you can talk, and he, in all seriousness, says you got to hope for a miracle. And what he's telling you is that he's not trying to say it's hopeless. I've talked to him about this slide many times, and you know, is it hopeless, Jack? And he says no, but he says people got to understand that you are fighting an uphill battle, and there has to be a sense of urgency. And if you look at a slideshow and you say, well, we could do this, we can do this, we can do that, it's no problem, they aren't that thick here yet, da-da-da-da-da. If there isn't a sense of urgency, you're behind the 8 ball right from the beginning. You ain't ever going to catch up with this animal. I mean, that's what he's saying. So you really do hope for a miracle. And what it takes is it takes cooperation from, you know, government and landowners, and everybody has to be on the same page, and that would take a miracle, right? On pretty much anything, especially when it has to do with management of animals. So there's some seriousness. It's not a joke. It really does take an awful lot of effort. I'm going to shut this down and put the lights back on. We are dead on schedule in that function at 8. Do you want to take a few minutes break? Would you like to? And yeah, see a few head nods. We'll just start right back up in 5 minutes, and we'll get out of here by 8 o'clock. Unless you have questions and stuff after that. So, pictures for a while, and I want to talk about a little bit about the pigs themselves and what I'd like you to do. You come to something like this, a prayer meeting like this, you're always going to be asked to do something. But if you don't think you've got hogs yet, you don't have a bona fide problem. If you do have a bona fide problem, you know, contact me and I'll put you in with somebody that could offer you some help, and you can take it or not take it, whatever. But if you're at the point where you've got some acreage, maybe with some cropland, you've got some woods, some plots for deer hunting that you put in, food plots, you've got some things that could be impacted by hogs, and I would suggest you start monitoring your property twice a year. And what that means is that, you know, a lot of people who have deer hunting acreage or a back area, they don't go in it too much except during maybe turkey season, deer season. Start to look in April, especially late April. If you're a farmer, it might be in the May before you can get your corn and beans start coming up, but watch it when it's in that 0 to 3 inch range. That's when usually the pigs will hit it. So sometime in that general period in the spring, you know, take a walk around and see if you're getting anything that looks like this kind of stuff I showed you. Do it again in late August, September, just before deer season. A lot of times we don't get any calls from people about hog damage for most of the year, and then we get it in September when two things are going on. They're getting ready for bow hunting season. They're starting to put trail cameras up. The corn is just at the right stage where hogs really start hitting it, and water's starting to get scarce. Hogs do not have scent lanes, so they've got to go to water. And they can be as sly and as spooky as they want, but they are going to still go to water during the night. And so a lot of times if you go out and maybe you only have water in a few spots on your property, forget everything else. Just go right to those spots. There might be a bend where a little pool lingers in one of your drainage ditches, or and by St. Charles, a lot of our rivers and creeks dry up late in the year. They're dried right up, and you'll have only an occasional pool. You just walk along that riverbank and just check those pools. So it can be done really, really fast. In the winter time, you can also make quick checks where at road crossings. A real good, easy way to tell is that, you know, deer will generally jump over the snow drifts at your crossings there where the ditch is, and the pigs can't jump that well. They can, but they usually don't. They just plow right through it. So if your snow drifts look like a bulldozer went through it, well, that's your bulldozer. That, you know, put on the brakes, get out, look, and maybe you'll see something that looks like hog tracks. So, you know, if you do that a couple times a year at the right time, you kind of know what you're looking for. You can get on the internet, and there's a lot of different sign help type things. We have, again, that if you go on our website, we've got some stuff on tracking and other signs to pick up on. Just familiarize yourself, and the earlier you pick up that you've got hogs on your property, the better. So that's what I'm asking. You know, I'm not asking you to send money anyplace or anything else. That's at the moment not really the problem. We're not, you know, we could always use more traps, and in a program they cost about $600 a piece. But right now we've got more traps than we have really good trapping sites. So eventually, if you do get hogs, and you can start in a trapping program, it can be done entirely by yourself, or if you don't want to do all that work and you want a volunteer to help you, we have 160 trained volunteers that can help. So there's ways to get it done. If you are in the food plot, into food plots for deer, those are like magnets. So generally speaking, we probably get more calls from people on food plot damage than anything else. One of our big problems right now is, frankly, that when hogs come to a neighborhood near you, they don't do all the stuff at once that I showed you on those slides. You know, you don't hit one with a car, wreck your car simultaneously, have your lawn tore up, all your crops ate, or anything else. Otherwise, everybody'd be after these things. But what they do is they do sometimes a little bit of damage. Sometimes they walk across your field or lawn and don't do anything. And so what happens in areas like your area, and in Midland County and Bay County and Saginaw, is the hog might walk through 8 properties and only get one person. Well, why do they choose that one person? You know, I don't know if they're sinners or what, but you know, the hog just happens to pick them and wreck their field. They'll go right past the others. So if you go down and right now in western Saginaw County or into eastern Gratiot County or any of these hot spots, you talk to pig people and you say, "You got pigs around here?" And they go, "Oh yeah, we got quite a few." What do you think? "Oh, they don't bother me. You know, I don't see the problem with them. You know, I shot one, 2 seasons ago, pretty good, tasted pretty good. So I don't see what the big deal is about." You'll hear that. And the next person will talk like the devil itself, has come in the form of a hog. And they're both telling you the truth. The hogs do not get everybody equally. And usually though, if the population gets real high, eventually they get you. And if you're the type of person that you've got plenty of money to rejuvenate your lawn, you've got lots of money, to replant your crops and time to do it, well, then they aren't ever going to bother you. But if you're like, most people, this is the kind of nuisance. It's not like having a raccoon get in the attic or, bats in your belfry. This is a big time thing, but it does not affect people equally. A couple of quick anecdotes. People say, "Well, ain't never seen one, so I don't think I have any around." Don't go by that, go by sign, and keep your ears open, because at the one of the meetings I had down in Midland County, one fella told everybody in the room, he says, "I have over 200 trail camera photos of hogs." He says, "In the last couple of years, I've never seen them, and I'm a deer hunter." Another person said, "I've trapped so many," he said, it was close to 30, he said, "I have thousands of trail camera photos of hogs. I've seen like 2 or 3 in the last, 4 years. And you just don't see them because they're nocturnal as heck. That's how they work. The Sounders, the basic social group, has 1, 2, maybe as many as 4 or 5 sows in it. One alpha sow, as we always talk about it as an alpha sow, a boss, a leader. She's kind of in charge, and then she'll have some subordinate sows, and they might have 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 sets of piglets from different litters with them. That's a typical sounder, and it can be from 6 to 20. They are not really that territorial. Now down south and in Texas, they are pretty territorial because they keep running into another sounder, and so they'll defend their area. But here, where we don't have as high a density, they'll tend to be more nomadic and roam all over. So somebody was asking me at break, well, do they hang around the same area all the time? No, they don't. They're not really, they don't have a strong territorial sense like a deer. So they are here today, gone tomorrow. That's why we always say in our trapping program is that from the time you see sign, real hot sign or some damage or something, you got about 15 days to lock them in on bait, or your chances of ever trapping one are really slim, because they aren't going to hang around. They'll go off some other place. So that's comforting to know if you do get damaged that they aren't going to necessarily pound you every night. They're going to, go down to the road.
How far do they range?
Yeah, that's, I knew somebody would ask me that. We really don't know. They will, the same group of hogs could move only a short distance if food and everything is real good and they've got an undisturbed spot they could get to. But once they start getting kicked out, like during deer season, gun deer season, then all bets are off. We think that's accounted for big time, long distance hog movements, especially in the first years after they got escaped from different game ranches. They ended up going quite you know, long distances just because they got spooked.
Well, we go long distance, be 20 miles.
Yeah, 20, 40. Then the boars, the males, will go that much just on their own, looking for different sounders. So usually if they have one hog and it's described as tusk, you know, out to here or whatever, they have tusk about, you know, yay big, and that's usually a male. And we don't worry about those as much as if there's a sounder. So the program is kind of aimed at getting sounders and trying to catch multiple pigs. That's what you're at. The most I've ever seen caught in a trap was 22, and that was in Hawaii. The most in Michigan, to my knowledge, that have ever been caught at one time is 5. And you have the pictures of that one. The first catch was in Mecosta County.
Now, do they bed in the same area like a domestic pig?
You mean the same spot?
Yeah.
No, but they'll, if they find like a swamp that they're real never bothered there, they'll keep going back to that one every time. One of the, how many in here manage your property according to QDM standards, quality deer management standards? Anybody in here? There's a couple, 2, 3 of you. You know, the QDM, not so much quality deer management group, but related ones tell you that there's certain things you need to do with your property to have big bucks on it. One thing is to, you want to provide a bedding area, what they call a sanctuary. Does this sound familiar? And the sanctuary basically is a spot where you're setting aside for the deer. You don't even go in it yourself very often. But you take 20 acres, and it's usually thick as heck, and if it isn't thick enough, you make it thick. You do some cuttings and stuff like that. You have your sanctuary, you have your food plots out around it, arranged to try to control the deer's movement a little bit, and not give it the incentive to go 5 miles down the road and get shot by somebody else. Okay, that's a crude summary of QDM, I admit, but that's the gist of it. Well, what you are creating then is hog haven. You know, that the hogs love you for it, and you know if they could speak, they'd thank you, you know, and everything, because they want to. That's all they want. They want a spot to stay out of trouble, and they want food plots here and there so they can travel a short distance, go back. So under that scenario, they won't move very far at all. So we find on some of these QDM managed areas, they'll sit right there and happily pound that person's food plot, you know, until they can't see straight, and take it all out, and etc. And I've had many discussions with people who did not want a hog trap because they were certain they had a Pope and Young or Boone and Crockett buck there, that if they just left him alone and didn't disturb the area, they'd get him. And I remember talking with one person who said, you know, I was on the phone with him 4 or 5 times because he was agonizing. He knew he had hogs, but he didn't know if he wanted to get into trapping because he thought it might scare the bucks, etc. And so I kept saying, well, look, if you've got them going in your sanctuary, the wild hogs, I said, I'm telling you, that buck you're talking about is not going to be bedding next to those. You know, it'd be like bedding next to a wolf. They think of the hog not as Porky the Friendly Corn Eater, but they think of that hog as a predator, you know, and so they're not going to be there. So we went on, and this is one of those I told you some stories. So when it all was said and done, he calls me the day after the muzzle looting season ended, and he said, okay, he says, you were right. I said, it's what? And he says, well, he said, we waited till the last day, never saw the buck I was after the whole season. And he said, we finally, out of frustration, the last day we drove that swale that, you know, was the sanctuary. And he says, out came 4 boars. We got 2 of them.
Jeez.
And so he had sat there all year waiting for the deer that was who knows how many miles down the road. But they don't mix real well with hog. Having said that, several people saw a deer and a big boar in the same field for about a 3-day period. Sometimes they'll tolerate them showing up in the field, but they aren't going to bed next to them, generally speaking. And so a lot of your QDM style efforts can get thwarted, and that's where a lot of the hogs are holed up. I mean, it's kind of ironic, because the people who best manage their area and kind of put the most time into it, that are the ones the hogs go to. So, we had, as many, Wildlife Services put up 2 webcams where you can, transfers the photos right directly to the computer and you can watch. And they had around 40 hogs in Mecosta County come into one flood. 40 at a time. That's how bad the problem is in some point. So if we're talking just a few hogs around this area, you ain't seen nothing yet. I mean, you really haven't. I mean, it can get really, really bad. Let me take a couple of minutes to show you how a hog trap works. There's some illustrations there. There's some video if you go to our website, but they're really, really simple. What they are is a fence. This is what they call the Missouri trigger with a rooter gate on it. And all it is a trap door and trigger. Okay, I'll show you exactly how it works in a second. So everybody can see this. Okay. This is set and anchored in with usually a steel post, or you can jam it next to a tree and secure it with wire and very sturdily, close the gap. We like to use at least 3 panels of fencing. We get them at Tractor Supply Company or someplace like this, and they have smaller holes down towards the bottom so they can't root their way out as effectively, and then we make a circle with it. And the circles, like the one on the photo there and in your handout, that's a 15-foot diameter circle, so it comes out to about here. Nothing magical about it. You can make them bigger, but I've been all around the country looking at these things, and almost everybody uses the 15-foot diameter. So I think it's just because that's what 3 of these standard panels get you. And nobody wants to pay for the 4th panel, I guess. But USDA has been lately, the Wildlife Services people, who sometimes come to these meetings with me, they are going, some cases, to a 4th or 5th panel, where they think they might get a lot of hogs. And then they're all those secured to some type of gate. Okay, so you can get an idea of the size of the opening, and what you do is you lay your bait out. Sometimes they'll have stringers out here. Corn is real effective. Sometimes they'll use soured corn, which is corn put with 1/3 of the buckets with water, the rest is corn. You let it ferment till the lid starts to raise, and you can't stand to be near it. And that's the corn that you use, soured corn, or just regular corn or anything else. You have that leading up to the trap, and then a big gob of it back here. Okay, so that's the basic setup. I've got this wire just so nobody would get hurt on it. So I'm going to take the wires off now so that the trap is ready to be set off. And then I'm going to have a volunteer crawl through this. On top of the head. But anyhow, these panels right here, there's 3 of them, and they're just sitting on this lip right here. So obviously, if you pull this out from it, they're going to come crashing down. So that's all I'm going to do. I'm just going to pull this. A string is attached. You might run it up from the top here to get more clearance. And you run this then back there. Actually, you have to have it enough so that it actually pulls out. So you attach your line anyway to the back and tie it to the fence panel that's back there. All right. Hog goes through, walks under the line, goes back to the bait, and then bumps it, okay, or trips over it. We have one of the little things we sometimes use is a PVC pipe filled with corn. It has little holes in it, and they'll start pushing that around, rolling it, and that kind of gets them to move left and right. They'll hit this, and then so this gets pulled like so. So that slams shut then. Now in theory, then let's say you caught the sow and she's in there eating and the piglets didn't come in. She set off the trap before, so they're out. they can push these individual panels in, because it's a one-way door, go in the joiner. Or if the piglets get caught, the sow can push her way in. In Michigan to date, we've never had a hog do that. Never had a piglet. When that door slams shut, they're gone, or they might stay, the sow might stay, but she won't do that. We have had, again, I've seen 22 pigs caught at once in Hawaii. You know, looked really good to me. And then the USDA and other, you know, we started doing this trapping stuff up here. And I don't do a lot of the trapping. I do like some setup and stuff. And, you know, so I'm not as involved as the USDA is working with the people on it. But they've had just about everything happen. I mean, but, and most of it very frustrating. They've had hogs come right up to the trap, stop, turn around. They've had piglets running right for the opening, ready to come in and have the sow cut them off, as if she's steering them away from it. All of that's occurred. The successful trapping back there that's showed on the photos with all the pigs laying there. And in that instance, I got a call one night from the guy, and he said, well, he says, I blew it. I said, what are you talking about? He says, I don't know. He says, they got my scent or something, and he says, they went right up to the trap door and they turned away. He said, the jig's up. I said, well, just, you know, I didn't really know what to tell him. He said, don't really panic yet. I says, freshen up the bait, go back to it. Anything could have happened, you know, who knows? You're dealing with an animal brain the size of a tennis ball, so, you know, you don't know exactly what happened. So then a couple nights later, he called me at 5. That's a 5 right there. Sometimes they'll act a little spooky and come back, and sometimes they won't. Raccoons will come in by the dozens, and they'll set off the trap. And we've got some photos of the raccoons in there eating the bait, while the hogs are all standing around the fence.
Trying to get in.
Our most productive trapper, at one site they have gotten 28 in a little over a year. They had saw visual proof with their own eyes that pigs can fly. They had a big pig they felt was probably 300 pounds. Smack into the fence a couple times as they approached, and or he approached. That was one time when the guy didn't. There's also a woman trapper that does real well. She out-traps everybody in the state. But they watched, and the pig just kind of dropped back a few feet and went right over the top. It's 54-inch high fence is what our standard is. So I was recommending that they just do like they do in other states. So when they get jumpers, they'll put a wire across the top, you know, just inside the thing, and then the pigs will hit that as they go over. Nah, he wasn't buying that. So he went and just got more panels and ran those panels up. So now his standard is like 7-8 foot fence.
Now you catch deer.
Huh?
Now you can catch deer.
Well, you do catch deer. I mean, believe it or not, deer will go through that and you can catch deer. But, you know, we like the lower fences because then a deer can easily jump out. But they'll jump those 8-foot fences if they have to. But we have had, that I'm aware of, at least 3 hogs go over the top. The fences are not set up, and we stake them and hook them to trees and brush and everything, so it's not necessarily like in a nice opening. But despite all that, it's not designed to hold hogs a long time, 1 or 2 days. And if you aren't there on day 3 to check the trap, the chances are excellent the hog ain't gonna be in there. So all kinds of things can happen. Is it safe? Yeah, trapping's really safe as long as you're sober and you follow common sense. And believe it or not, one of the common ways that people get hurt is they'll have the thing, you know, here, and they talk about 2 real common occurrences for injuries, and that person will come, for whatever reason, will not shoot through the holes in the fences. Now, they're this big, and if you can't shoot through that from 5 yards away, you don't belong with a gun in your hand. But anyhow, they'll go and lean over the fence to shoot unobstructed down on the pig. And about the time they lean over and get their sights, the pig decides to jump at that movement and then shoves the gun up the guy's nostrils. And then if he's really, you know, unlucky, it'll hook its hoofs in there, come over the top, and then you're in a world of hurt. So those kinds of things can occur. The other one that I've heard of, I don't think it happens very often, but 3 people will go out and they'll have, 15 hogs in a trap someplace, and they'll all surround it. And they start shooting, and then they decide to move, and they shoot each other in the foot and stuff like that. But by and large, as we speak, somebody's trapping hogs somewhere, and they do it without incidents. So it happens all the time. Some of them take the hogs out alive, some of them kill them. In our program, they're always killed, and what we're really interested in doing, if you end up ever being a cooperator that traps, the only thing that the program asks is that you try to call a number that USDA gives you when they drop off the trap. Try to call that number so they can try to get a veterinarian over to take a blood sample for pseudorabies. The pseudorabies test, the blood sample has to be taken generally very soon after the hog is killed, like within an hour. So it's not something like you can field dress it, call on Monday or something. If you get the hog on Friday, you'll still get a good sample. So they're very concerned about that, but they always tell you too that if you can't do it, for whatever reason, you can't wait, go ahead and shoot the hog, because the important thing is that we'd rather have a dead hog than a big production made over the blood sample tape. So here's what I guess I'm telling you in a nutshell as far as this help program. If you have hogs and you know for sure you get them, USDA will usually ask you to go through a little bit of a process to verify it for them that you've got hogs that are trappable. It's not like they aren't going to believe you that there's hogs there, like you're making it up, but there's hogs just pass through, and then there's hogs that are trappable. And the ones that are trappable are hanging around a little bit, and you can lock them in on bait. And so, because if you see hogs running across your field on November 15th, that does not mean you have a hog problem. That just means some hogs are running through, they got spooked by hunters. So they'll ask you to start putting bait out, or they'll even bring you some. And then if you lock them in on bait, they'll sometimes bring a trail camera out, set it up. And when you get those things coming 2, 3, 4 days, they'll start to set the trap up, and they'll do it panel by panel, finally add the gate, or put the gate first, then add the panels, and then they finally seal it. So it's like a 5 to 6 day, or sometimes even slightly longer process. That's the best way, ideal way. Scent control is really important, so you don't want to leave your scent on the trap, so you get some instructions on that. And that's it. Nobody from the government or anybody else comes and takes the hog from you. You can eat it, do whatever you want. They are safe to eat, as long as it's cooked. You're not going to get anything